Welcome in, APUSH Nation members, new members of the nation, that is. This is your very first Fireside chat. And today I'm going to be talking about a topic where we left off in class last week, which is the Jamestown colony. Now, I made a comment in class about how remarkable it truly is that the Jamestown colony even survived in the first place. And those were factors due to the poor geography of the Chesapeake region, the fact that the English settlers were not acclimated yet to the weather and the diseases that were present in the Chesapeake region. But I want to get into a few more factors today that contributed to the death and mortality of the Jamestown colony. Now, just keep in mind that when the colony was first formed by the Virginia Company in 1607, you had approximately about a little over 100 people were there living in Jamestown community. But in the initial years, disease and famine seemed to be everywhere, and death was an omnipresent reality in the colony. Particularly hard-hitting for the Jamestown settlers were the winter periods, which historians now refer to as the starvation era. The numbers of Jamestown settlers dropped precipitously in the first few years, and especially during the winter, mostly due to the fact of the poor fertile land, the lack of fertile land, I should say, where the colony was established, and the fact that the early settlers just simply had a difficult time farming and making sustainable, growing sustainable crops in the marshy, swampy region that Jamestown was founded. In fact, by 1609, so 2 years into the colony, the population dropped from about 500 settlers to 60 in 6 months. I mean, that is just a remarkable statistic to soak in. And it really highlights the fact that, first and foremost, the settlement of the New World by the English, particularly this one joint stock company, the Virginia Company, was going to be an arduous process. Now, it wasn't just simply disease and starvation that killed so many Jamestown settlers in large waves. Historians have actually come up with pretty interesting parallels that disease and starvation, while certainly they took a great share of the men and women that eventually came to Jamestown, apathy was one of the most brutal killers of people at Jamestown. And the analogy that historians have discovered is that the plight of Jamestown settlers was very akin to what occurs to prisoners of war in prison camps. And so historians have studied the effects of American prisoners of war in both World War II and Korea. And they compared it back to diary and journal entries from Jamestown settlers. And the results were pretty staggering, because what the studies indicated was that apathy, the lack of desire to improve one's situation when in a predicament, simply allowed for diseases and other maladies to strike faster and more efficiently. Now, why would someone not want to survive when they're in a life or death situation? Well, there was constant fear all surrounding the people living in Jamestown. And when you see your fellow settlers dying in such fast rates, this allows for a sense of futility to creep into the mind, according to psychologists and according to historians who have studied this. So a lot of settlers just simply gave up. They ceased to believe that there was an outcome that would end with their survival and their success. And so apathy crept in, and this was a particularly difficult problem for the leadership of the Jamestown colony. Now, eventually, one of the leaders who became governor of Jamestown, you probably know this guy's name, Captain John Smith. And where have you heard that name? No, it's not because Smith is a great last name or that I am related to John Smith. However, you've probably heard it from the Disney film Pocahontas. But the relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas and the Native Americans, something I'll get to by the end of this video, is nothing quite like the Disney feature. Let me just tell you, Colors of the Wind was not being sung by the Jamestown settlers or the local Powhatan Native American tribes. But for John Smith and other leadership of the Jamestown colony, The fact that people just simply were giving up hope did not bode well for the existence and the survival and the success of the colony. And again, this is more of a psychological effect, but eventually, if you give up in the mind, psychologists will find that in prisoner of war situations, the same thing goes. The body will start to also relent. And so certainly the sense of futility that was just ever present and the wrestling with morality took almost as much of a toll on the Jamestown settlers as anything else. Another factor that historians have discovered was most integral in killing settlers efficiently was diet. The settlers mostly ate a maize or corn-based diet, lacking your basic nutrients and proteins especially. So if your body goes without protein for an extended period of time, anorexia, muscle dwarfing can certainly become a massive problem for the body. And again, this can kind of factor back into the apathy aspect because the body just becomes too weak. And so when you factor those two issues together, you're looking at a recipe for disaster. So Jamestown was certainly not a place where people were going and thriving. And it took hard years for the Virginia Company to begin to figure out how to make this colony fruitful. Now, I'm going to save that question for class tomorrow. But the last thing I want to get into with you guys this morning, because I've got to get ready for the Arsenal game, as you can see. I mean, I guess it's fitting that on the season open for the Gunners here, we're talking about English life importing to America. So what more than sitting down and watching a Premier League match this morning is more fitting, I suppose. But I want to talk about relationships with the Native Americans. And again, this is going to sort of parlay into class topic conversation tomorrow. But since we're on the topic of death and mortality in Jamestown, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you guys about the critically important period of Jamestown between 1619 and 1622. These were some of the hardest years for Jamestown. And most of that had to do with a terrible loss of life at the hands of the local Powhatan, P-O-H-W-A-T-A-N, that's Powhatan. In 1622, the Powhatan Confederation of tribes and natives in the Jamestown region, which had interacted for the last 12 years with the settlers. Don't get me wrong, this is not the first time that these natives came across the Jamestown settlers. But the Powhatan Confederation of Tribes decided in 1622 to attack not just the Jamestown settlement, but other English settlements that were forming along the James River in the surrounding region. There had been coexistence between the two sides, English and Native. However, the tension finally boiled over and resulted in a mass attack that took the lives of over 340 settlers in both Jamestown and surrounding regions. The effect of the 1622 attack, and that's sort of, there isn't really a war here. This is just, it's referred to as the 1622 attack at Jamestown, had devastating effect on the colony, mostly because it spoiled for future settlers a sense that coexistence was possible. Certainly, word got out about the Jamestown massacre in 1622, and it spread to England. But it also spread north, where a new colony was forming in Plymouth. And for many English that were arriving in the New World in future years, the legacy of the Jamestown attack in 1622 never quite faded. And it cemented within the mindset of English settlers, both that were there in Jamestown and survived the attack, and for future Jamestown settlers, that it was not possible to coexist with Native Americans, that they couldn't be trusted because the attack was somewhat of a surprise, that they would kill women and children, burn and pillage as they so did. And please, don't get me wrong, I am not in any way blaming or pointing the finger at the Native American tribes here. We're going to have plenty of time to evaluate not just this attack, but other attacks as well. Now, to just give you an overall context and wrap things up with a statistic. In this critical period of 1619 to 1622, when death was more widespread than ever before, The Virginia Company had about 4,200 people living in Jamestown in 1619. At the end of 1619, when this attack occurred, the colony was down to 1,200 people. 1,200 people. That's astonishing. Just an astonishing figure. So I hope that with that being said, perhaps there comes a greater admiration, understanding, awareness, whatever you want to call it, that colonies were not founded immediately. This was a slow, tough sled, and the English would need numerous factors to combine to where they could ultimately make Jamestown the first thriving settlement in the New World. And those are going to be factors that we start talking about tomorrow. So with that, I say have a great rest of your day. Go Arsenal, or go whoever you root for. I always end these things the same way, and I'm going to keep that tradition alive. So I will remind you that before we leave this Sunday, the past shapes the future. Take care, APUSH Nation. See you tomorrow.